It's great to see so many of you here. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Lindsay Macmillan, and I'm the Director of the Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities, or CPO, here at UCL. And we're delighted to welcome you here today, along with our partners from Georgetown University Global Economic Challenges Network, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and the Social Research Institute here at UCL. I won't take the full 10 minutes to do an introduction, but I do just want to take this opportunity to set the scene before we move on to hearing about the research and have the policy panel. So our event on higher education access and funding really couldn't be more timely. It's recognised now that our existing higher education funding model is under immense strain. As work by the IFS has shown, most of the university's teaching resource now come from tuition fees charged to students. Since the tuition fee reform back in 2012, the cap on fees has only increased once from £9,000 to £9,250. And this is despite periods of high inflation eroding the real value of fees by around 20% over that period. Particularly timely is the Migration Advisory Committee just released their rapid review just over an hour ago now on what should happen to the graduate route. And it's worth noting that our system is increasingly reliant on international students, which may be in direct conflict with some of the other priorities of the government. Of course, we're not alone in facing these challenges here in the UK, and we'll hear later in our second session from our distinguished international guests from the US and Australia. International perspectives here are really vital for understanding what viable alternatives there are for our system. So we need to think about a policy design that can create a sustainable higher education funding model today. But this also needs to be equitable. A CPO briefing note prepared by Paul Martin, published earlier this month, has shown that despite hundreds of millions of pounds being poured into widening participation outreach initiatives by universities over the past decade, participation gaps in higher education have at best remained very stubborn and at worst have slightly worsened over that period. The recent cost of living crisis and the erosion in the value of student maintenance support will add to those concerns in future. Access to higher education can be life-changing for disadvantaged students, as we'll hear in our first session. So we therefore need to keep equity concerns at the front of our minds, along with sustainability, when we're thinking about policy options. Now, I realise this has been a bit of a downer. It is going to be a great day, I'm sure. So we've split the day into three parts. The first part we're going to hear from John Friedman, who's come across from Brown University, and our very own Claire Crawford and Jill Winus from CPO at UCL, where we're going to be thinking about access to higher education and inequalities in access in particular. In the second session, we're going to focus on higher education funding with talks from Sue Dynarski from Harvard University, from Jack Britton from York University and the IFS, and from Bruce Chapman, who's joined us from Australian National University. Finally, we've got a 90-minute policy panel. I'm very excited about this one, chaired by Anna Vignoles and joined by some great guests, where we're going to be talking through lessons from other countries and trying to figure out, or finally fix, the higher education funding problem that we have here. We're going to workshop it today, guys, so get comfy. So I have some usual admin to deliver. There's no fire alarm test due, so if you do hear a fire alarm, we need to leave via the fire exits, which are located around the doors, the room. Having worked in this building for the last 5 years, it probably still doesn't mean a fire, but leave anyway. We'll feed you, we'll keep you hydrated at various points throughout the day, and we invite you to join us after the event, once we've solved this monumental problem, to have a celebratory drinks reception. So with that, I'll hand over to Frank to chair the first session.
Even started by President Obama in the 2012 State of the Union address. He's worked at the National Economic Council as a special assistant to the President for Economic Policy during the Obama administration, research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a member of the Treasury Advisory Council on the Racial Inequity for the US Department of Treasury, and he's also a co-editor of the American Economic Review. So, John, could I ask you to come up here? And the title of your talk is Higher Education and Upward Mobility. What can we learn from big data? So thanks very much, John. Thanks for coming.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for helping put this together, and to Lorraine and everyone here. This is going to be a great day. I want to help us start the day out by really starting from a broad frame and thinking about what is the purpose of higher education, and when we then set up the funding system, what are the problems that we're trying to solve to make sure that it's functioning not just to educate individual students, but to provide the type of broad access to mobility that I think is critical, not just for educational systems, but for societies at large. So, here is just kind of to motivate what the problem is. This does not, oh, other way. I see, but then that is going to come out here. That is confusing. So what this chart shows is what I think is one of the greatest challenges of our time, which is the fact that social mobility has been falling. Here I'm showing you both in the United States in green and in the UK in yellow over the past 50 years. Why has it been falling? It's been falling primarily because the growth that we've had has not been equitably distributed. We've seen, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, substantially faster growth at the top of the income distribution compared to at the bottom of the income distribution. Now, there are many, many forces that are part of that, but as I'll argue as we go through the talk, I think that equitable access to education is one of the core problems, but also a path, if we can solve that problem, to reverse this decline and provide a lot more opportunity. Now, I titled the talk, What Can We Learn from Big Data? Because I think we've been looking at time series like this for a long time, but it's just really difficult to know. Right here we see the US and the UK have been declining. Sweden is actually doing substantially better than we are, especially in the first 40 years or so, in the 40 years of generations after World War II. But it's really difficult to know just from looking at these really aggregate series, what is it exactly that Sweden is doing right to have its line higher and what we are doing wrong. Is it something about the social support network? Is it something about the education system? Is it about the prevalence of smoked herring? Right? It's just very difficult to know from a slide like this. And so what my colleagues and I have done over the past 10 years or so is really tried to take advantage of the large new data sets that are available to dig down into this problem and understand what are the sources of these gaps in mobility, and what does that tell us about where we can try to solve them. So there are then maps that we've made like this. This is actually a version of the Opportunity Atlas from folks here at UCL, looking at how opportunity is not, it's been falling overall, but it is really differentially available to individuals depending on where they grow up. So here you see that in the redder areas in England, the opportunities for kids growing up in poverty, where do they get to when they get adults? They're substantially lower than they are in the Southeast. But even in the Southeast, if you kind of zoom into this region around London, you see that there's a substantial variation, even within just 10 or 20 kilometers of where we're standing. And we've done this in the US down to the neighborhood level. So this is a version of the same map for New York City. And you can see here, these red areas are neighborhoods where children growing up in poverty see substantially lower levels of success and economic security in adulthood, right? And so the types of differences here that we see at the level of literally going a kilometer in one direction or another, you see things flip. For instance, here, this is Brooklyn down here, you see, things can flip from deep red, kind of a very, very low opportunity neighborhood to blue, which is a very high opportunity neighborhood. That's going to be about 400 or 500 meters in the scale there. So why is this happening? What are the causes? What are the factors that contribute to this? So I'm not going to go through it in kind of a ton of detail here, but there seem to be a set of factors when you look across these neighborhoods that relate to socioeconomic issues, but they also relate perhaps more profoundly to the environment in which children are growing up. So here are 4 factors that contribute to higher opportunity levels for children growing up in poverty across neighborhoods. And I think, you see something like lower poverty rates and you think, well, like if only we just pump more money in, that would fix the problem. But it's a bit more subtle than that, because what matters about the poverty rates is actually not so much directly the amount of income that your family has. It's about the income and the employment rates and activities of all the other families in the neighborhood, the other adults that children are interacting with. And I think one can see this most clearly when you see that social capital is this key factor here on the right. We can make maps of what these opportunities look like in the United States. So here on the left, this is a map of upward mobility for kids growing up in poverty. And on the right here is a map of what my colleagues have deemed economic connectedness is measured from Facebook data, right? You see the things just look almost identical, and this is true not only at the national level, this is true if you reproduce things at the local level as well. Why is that important? It's because I think traditionally we've seen higher education as primarily about educating individuals in the classroom, giving them skills for the workforce, and for sure that's true. But what I think this highlights, and the reason why I think higher education is such a key part of increasing upward mobility and fixing this broad social problem that I started with, is because universities provide so much more, right? It's not just about educating students in the classroom, it's providing a whole ecosystem in which they are discovering what they want to do, they're seeing what all the possibilities are, they're getting links to the labor force, they're getting links to other individuals who are growing up around them. And I think that this is actually a huge part of what generates mobility more generally, and then I think what generates mobility out of higher education. We're going to talk about solving the funding problem later on today, but I think that if we just think about this as how do we help students pay for, or just directly pay for students to kind of sit in classes and listen to people like me lecture at them, I think that is really underselling what the purpose and what the benefits are of higher education. So when you think about upward mobility as coming from not just these kind of narrow inputs, but just shaping the broader environment in which children and students are growing up, you land on kind of 3 main buckets of policies that can help support upward mobility. One of them is about reducing segregation. Another one is about investing in neighborhoods where children are spending, call it the first 18 or 19 years of their life. And then higher education, I think, is really the third large bucket where we really can make progress, because it starts to stand in for one's neighborhood and community for the next number of years, and really these are critical years in terms of transitioning into economic security and a successful career. And so I'm going to kind of dig in here, as is the topic of the day, but I think a lot of what I'm going to say may have similar themes when we talk about neighborhoods and K-12 schools as well. I'm happy to talk to anyone about that. So let's keep using big data, and we're going to try to, again, get inside the problem of how not just higher education in general, but how specific institutions of higher education seem to be supporting mobility. And so this is a graph that I put together in the United States, which we call the mobility report cards. So each dot on this graph is an institution of higher learning in the United States. There are about 2,500 of the gray dots on this chart, and I've highlighted a few of them in green just to give you a sense of where some of the colleges that you may or may not have heard of locate. The axes for this start the horizontal axis. This is about a measure of access for students. And so the particular statistic that we're using here is the fraction of students at an institution that come from the poorest fifth of families in society. These are children growing up in families living roughly below the poverty line. But there's nothing magical about that particular definition. And so you see here that there's enormous variation in this statistic across institutions, right? At some institutions, so Sue and I were at Harvard. At Harvard, there are about 4% of these students from the bottom fifth of the income distribution. And at other colleges, here's Los Angeles Community College, so more like 30. And some colleges out here, you get well over 40. So enormous variation in the extent of access. Now, part of that is going to relate to the level of selectivity, the level of education. And it's natural to think that when students grow up in poverty, they're going to have less access to education and other resources earlier in life, which is going to lead them to be less academically prepared by the time they're going to university. But what I think becomes clear from when you do it this way is that there's an enormous amount of variation even among schools that are quite similar academically. So for instance, here, we have San Mateo Community College District. So this is a 2-year community college, which is essentially an open access university, the lowest level of academic selectivity in the United States. This has about 10% of students from very low income families. And here's San Francisco Community College. So San Francisco is about 30 miles north of San Mateo. So it's like basically in the same large urban area. And they have more like 18 or 19%. So almost double the number of students that are coming from poverty, despite what is a very similar institution located very nearby. Similarly, here you see all the colleges that are much kind of at the very top of the selectivity tier in the United States. You see UC Berkeley, which is probably the best public institution in the United States. That has significantly more students from low-income families than do these Ivy League schools here, which are private universities, despite, again, existing at a very, very similar level of selectivity. The vertical axis is showing for students from poverty who attend these institutions, where do they then have outcomes when they get out into the labor force? And again, the particular statistic that we've used here is earning in the top 20% of the US age-specific income distribution. So you want to think of this as earning more than about $60,000. You need to have a good, solid job, but this is not about becoming a hedge fund manager or becoming a partner at a law firm. There are many jobs that can provide this. And again, what you see is that these, probably not surprisingly, these most selective schools have students that are the most successful in the long term. Community colleges tend to have students that are less economically successful. But again, it's not just about the level of selectivity. Here, if you see there's a bunch of vertical variation. So again, focusing on community colleges, this is the City University of New York. You can compare, that's part of the CUNY system. They have approximately the same number of students coming from low-income families as the LA Community College District, and yet you see that City University has students that are much, much more likely to end up economically secure by this and many other measures. And so this is something that we did in the US, but again, team here at IFS has done something that is very similar for the UK, and so here you see what is a very similar pattern where schools from different tiers of selectivity, the most selective universities tend to be up in this upper left-hand corner. The least selective universities are kind of spread out across the bottom here, but you see a substantial amount of variation even among schools of similar selectivity. And even here, what's nice in this study is that you can not even just compare students from different universities, you can even do it for students in what are comparable programs between universities. And so just to highlight here, right, we're here at UCL. Queen Mary is, kind of similar institution, but has students with considerably broader access, and that holds kind of program by program as well. So here are students studying economics at UCL and Queen Mary. and the, here for 4 other fields of study, and you see that the pattern is kind of holding even within fields of study. And so I think, what this motivates as a question is to take this as kind of a lens to say, well, what is going on that allows the economics program at Queen Mary to have almost as good outcomes as the economics program at UCL, despite doing so with 3 or 4 times the number of students from low-income families? What can we see about what's different there that can, again, then prompt us to think about policies that might help move all universities towards there? And what I think this also highlights, and this is the type of analysis that the big data revolution has enabled, is that the differences between UCL and Queen Mary, that may not be the same set of barriers for students from low-income families as at a much less selective set of schools, right? There's no reason that the same solution is going to be the right answer in all contexts. But what this lets us do is really dig in and not try to solve problems in kind of broad brush, kind of one solution for everyone type ways, but to really understand what is going on in very particular circumstances, and where does that lead? Is it about funding? Is it about something else? And I'm going to kind of finish up here by trying to walk you through an example of how we've done this recently for schools, quite selective schools like this in the United States. And even though I think that's going to point in a direction that turns out, I think, to not be about funding, I think it's a nice example of how one can really dig in and understand what are the particular barriers in these different circumstances. So we call this a pipeline approach, and the way we're going to go through this is to, for universities, start by looking at all the students in the country who have come out of high school at a similar level of academic preparation. And so we're going to have to do this imperfectly because we don't have a perfect measure of academic preparation, but we do want to make sure that when we are thinking about different students who could attend different institutions, we're taking account of the fact that a lot has already happened in students' lives before they're at the point of thinking about applying to university or applying to university. So the way we're going to do this is by comparing students that get the same score on one or the other of a pair of standardized tests, which are taken by most students in the United States. These are called the SAT and the ACT tests. There's a wide-ranging debate about exactly, whether what these tests capture, and are they appropriate as a measure of academic preparedness? Are they biased against students from less well-resourced backgrounds? For this purpose, if they are biased against kids from low-income backgrounds, that's actually going to mean that there are even more disparities than I'm showing you. So this kind of what I'm going to show you is like a lower bound on what's going on if there's bias. In some separate work for this particular context I'm going to talk about, I think there's less bias, but again, that's a local finding that's not necessarily true for all contexts. So how do we do this? Well, just to start with a very kind of narrow example, this is a graph. If we just look at all students in the U.S. that get in about the top 0.5 percentile of on these tests, and you can just ask, what share of them end up attending Yale? Yale is a very selective university in the U.S. It's a very, it's primarily taking students that have scored at this extreme high end of the test. Everyone on this graph has gotten this extremely high score on the test. But what you see is that about 3% of students from the bottom 95% of the income distribution are attending Yale. This is spiking up so that by the time you get to the top 0.1% of the income distribution, so these are students that grew up in families making about $3-4 million a year on average. Now, more like 10% of those students are attending Yale. And so, you ask, well, we saw on that earlier graph, Yale was one of the schools that students do very, very well coming out of it, but it does not have a diverse group of students. And so, we can start to ask, well, first of all, is that just because they're only taking students with such high test scores? Well, yes, in part. But even when we look among students that essentially got the same thing, you still see this huge skew in who's ending up attending Yale. So let's see if we can figure out why that's the case. Now, we don't want to only look at students that got this particular test score. So what we're basically going to do is we're going to average together lots of different lines that look like this for each institution, weighting together these different lines with the share of students that actually have these test scores at these institutions. And so what that produces is a plot that looks like this. Once you average all these things together, it's very hard to interpret these in absolute levels. And so the way to interpret the vertical scale on the axis here is to ask, how much more likely are students from a given socioeconomic background to be attending these schools compared to students from other socioeconomic backgrounds, but with the exact same test score? So what you see here is that you see this same kind of very sharp uptick. For students in the top 1%, they are about 80% more likely to be attending. This graph combines these data for all 12 of the kind of the most selective private institutions in the US, the Ivy Plus group. They're about 80% more likely to be attending than the average student with the same test score. And students from kind of the upper middle class here, around the 60th to 80th percentile, these students are actually 20% less likely to be attending these schools than the average student with the same test score. So if you want to put those two things together, these students from the top 1% are about 2.5 times more likely to be attending these schools than students from the upper middle class. And also note what comes out of these data. It's actually these upper middle class students who are the least likely to attend these schools, conditional on having a kind of a test score in the right range. Students from low-income families, they are less likely than average, but slightly more likely than students from these middle-income families. So what's going on here? We can kind of continue to keep digging, and the way we'll do this is by, first of all, calculating, how many students, is this like a big deal or not? This hook shape is leading to about 168 extra students from the top 1% of families. That's about 10% of the average starting first-year class. So 10% of students are from very wealthy families, and they are attending these schools because of the fact that these attendance rates are so much higher for high-income students. Right? They're there in ways that you would not have expected merely from the fact that students from high-income families do get higher test scores on average. So what's going on there? Why is that the case? Well, it's useful actually to draw a contrast between what this graph looks like in these private schools with what they look like in some of the most selective public schools in the US. Right? So you can draw the same graph, and what you get is something that looks very, very different here in yellow. It is still the case that students from high-income families are overrepresented at these most selective public institutions. But you can see the shape looks totally different, right? It's not got this spike up at the top. It's this kind of broad overrepresentation in the top 5, maybe top 10%. And you can even see it's actually lower among students from very, very high-income families, right? Students from very, very high-income families are actually almost attending at the same rates. And that's going to be the first signal that where this type of pipeline analysis leads for the most selective private schools in green is going to be a different place than where they lead for the most selective public schools in yellow. There's also a ton of difference even among specific private schools on this list. So here's 4. We have data for about 140 different schools for these curves on our website, right? And so you can see how at a school like Dartmouth, all these schools have this kind of broad same pattern, but this spike up at the top is much, much higher at a school like Dartmouth than it is at a school like Harvard or even Chicago. So in order to keep digging, we're just going to try to ask, where are these 168 extra students coming from? The next kind of layer of disaggregation, we're going to ask, are they coming through extra applications? Are these high-income students much more likely to be applying to these schools? Are they more likely to be admitted when they apply? Are they more likely to attend when they're admitted? Each of those steps of the pipeline, I think, is going to link with different potential policies, right? So for instance, if it's all about financial aid at these schools, you would expect students who were admitted to be maybe less likely to attend, or maybe they wouldn't even apply in the first place. Whereas if it's about the admissions decision, right, that's something that's entirely on the school side. And so, are the schools making decisions that are effectively biased against students from these low and middle income families? And it's going to turn out in this context that almost the majority of these 168 students are coming because of the admissions process. So this is a curve that is almost the same as what I showed you before, except instead of asking what's the rate at which students with a similar test score attend the school, we're just asking among students with a similar score who applied to the school, what fraction are admitted? And here you see that students from high-income families are substantially more likely to be admitted, again, even relative to students with the very same test score from low and middle-income families. And here you see this kind of U shape starting to become a little bit more pronounced. Students from the lowest income families are somewhat more likely to be admitted, and then it kind of dips down in the middle, and then it spikes back up at the end. So that students from these very most wealthy families are more than twice as likely to be admitted than the average student with the same test score. And again, nearly 2.5 times as likely to be admitted as a student from the upper middle class. And you can, again, then kind of go through a process to come up with a number out of this. And what you find is that this is going to account for about 2/3 of that 168 students. Again, this is something that does not happen at the most selective public schools in the US. At the most selective public schools, if you draw this same graph in yellow, it's almost entirely flat. And if anything, it's slightly downward sloping. That's saying that students from lower income families are more likely to be admitted with the same test score than students from higher income families. And so even though many of these most selective public institutions are actually not more diverse than these most selective private institutions, the underlying drivers are very, very different, right? So Sue's presumably going to talk later today about part of what's going on behind this yellow line, which has much more to do with financing, based on a bunch of her great work at the University of Michigan, which is part of this line. But at these private schools, the source seems to be very different. And without getting kind of too much into the weeds, especially for kind of a U.S. institutional thing compared to the broader problem of financing, when you break down what's going on, as I said, about 2/3 of this 168 are coming from students who are not admitted. And within that, you can actually identify 3 particular, in some sense, very peculiar aspects of the admissions processes at these schools. One, that there are strong preferences given to the children of previous alumni from these schools. 2, that these schools put quite a bit of effort into running effectively minor league sports franchises as part of their institution. And 3, and this is, I think, a bit more subtle and perhaps broad, there's a lot of focus put on non-academic credentials, things like, does this person seem interesting? And it turns out that, students, admissions officers find it much more difficult to benchmark that and adjust for circumstance, right? You can say that, somebody didn't take as many advanced courses because they were at a high school that didn't offer them, and correct for that in the admissions process. It's much more difficult to do that on these non-academic dimensions. So again, this is what ends up driving a bunch of these access disparities at this particular set of schools, but this is not something that's universal. And I think that what I really hope to you can take away is that by using these big data, one can, I think, get to the root of this in a way that, for instance, for these particular schools, it's just about changing their admissions policies, but at other schools, it's going to be about changing other things. So let me just close in 5 minutes by kind of telling you, more about what one might be able to do in this particular context. So we've identified these particular issues. There are a couple other layers that one has to go through to get to potential policy changes. So, for instance, one can ask, like, does attending these schools even matter, right? Are we just collecting people who are going to do well anyway, or is there a causal effect on students' outcomes? Turns out there is. Schools like this turn out to have a very large impact, especially on outcomes for getting into kind of really prestigious leadership-type positions in society. So, this is studying what's going on in the U.S. I would not be surprised if there's something similar that's operating for some of these most selective schools in the UK. There's another question one can ask about, does broader admissions policies, would they somehow sacrifice quality, right? Maybe finding students who are great rowers, but maybe less good students, maybe those people have some other characteristic they're going to go on to lead them to be very, very successful in life. And even though it ends up attracting higher income students, maybe those are the people that seem to, be destined to do great things. That turns out not to be true either. So you can look at here these kind of 3 different particular preferences. These are in fact not correlated with higher success as adults once the students get out of college. The thing that actually does predict success are these academic ratings, which are the one thing that are not part of driving these biases. And then finally, you can ask, well, putting it all together, could you actually, could you meaningfully change the composition of these classes by changing some of these policies? And the answer is yes. So starting from the actual, right, there are about 60% of students that come from low and middle income families at present. If you changed these types of admissions policies, that these 3 that we identified, you could increase the share of students from low and middle income families meaningfully. What's more, you could do so while actually increasing class quality because you are focused more on the dimensions that predict it, which are these academic dimensions, which I think also just makes sense more generally for an institution that is focused on teaching and learning to be focused on these more academic credentials. And so, you could actually, you could increase the share of students who you are kind of propelling from low and middle income backgrounds to these positions of leadership in society as a way that these institutions are contributing to that broad social mobility. So let me just conclude. Happy to then take questions before moving on to the next panel. What are just kind of 4 lessons that I think apply broadly about how to use big data in order to help solve these access problems in higher education. So the first thing is just to emphasize that these universities are really critical institutions in the broader picture of mobility. You're not going to solve all those mobility problems in society by making college more equitably accessible, but it's going to be a big chunk of it. And so I think it's really a critical set of institutions to the extent that one wants to make progress on this more broadly. Second, as I hope I've convinced you, big data can really help to diagnose what the barriers are in a very local way, so that when we think about policy change, we are solving the problems that we face and overcoming barriers that students are facing, as opposed to solving barriers that maybe other students face but are not faced by students in a particular circumstance. Third, this is something, what I talked about at the end here. I think that it's very difficult to, I think sometimes we want to focus on these types of non-academic aspects as a way towards creating more access. And I think that's something that in the data seems to actually backfire and go the other way. That when you open it up that way, it seems like the ability of students from from higher income backgrounds to kind of figure out the right thing to write and the right way to pitch themselves can overcome what is a well-intentioned desire to broaden things out. And then finally, I think that all of this has been about diagnosis, but we can then use these data in an ongoing way to see once policy changes have been made, have the data actually moved in the direction that we want, right? And this really should be a continual feedback loop towards improving access and supporting broader mobility. So let me stop there. Totally fine. Yes, I was just going to ask. Yes, defer to you all. So perfect.
I'm an associate professor here at CPO, which Lindsay already introduced. And yeah, Jill and I are going to do a bit of a double act. We're going to be very much singing from the same hymn sheet as you've just heard from John about the US, but giving you a bit more on the UK perspective. And do you want to say anything about Jill? We'll go just literally one after the other. So.
Okay, well, give me a second now. I lost my... So Jill is the Professor of Economics and the Deputy Director of the Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities at the University College London Institute of Education. She's also a Research Associate at the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics. Her school work has been published in the Journal of Labour Economics, Economics of Education Review, the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, and the Journal of Human Capital.
Great, thank you very much. So yeah, as I mentioned, Jill and I will do a bit of a double act. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the extensive margin. So who goes to university, what do the gaps look like there, and a little bit about what explains those gaps from a UK perspective. And then I'll kind of tee off Jill with by showing you some of the gaps, focusing more on the intensive margin, which John was really focusing on in his presentation. And she'll talk a little bit more about her work using university and student match and what that looks like and some of the drivers there. So I'm going to kick off by just showing you a couple of figures that are published by the UK Department for Education. So these are showing you the progression rate for different cohorts of school leavers and showing you what proportion of those individuals go on to university either at 18 or 19, so straight after taking their A-level or equivalent exams or the following year. And that's really the majority of students who are going to university, at least when they're relatively young. And it's splitting the cohort into two groups. So one in the lighter blue is showing you students who at some point during their secondary school education were eligible for free school meals, so an indicator of relatively low family income. And then it's comparing that with the remaining students, so roughly the 80% of students who do not fit that category. And it's showing you how that's changed over time, during which we've had the higher tuition fees that Lindsay was mentioning, but that they've stayed relatively stagnant. And you can see that there's been some increase in participation for both groups over this period, but that gap, as Lindsay was saying, has really remained stubbornly persistent over this period. So around 20 percentage points difference between those from lower family incomes and the rest who are going to university. And then this is just breaking it down a little bit further, so we don't have more detailed family income information in the way that John does for those 80% who are not eligible for free school meals in our administrative data. So this is instead breaking students down according to the type of neighbourhood in which they live. So this is a measure of, a kind of historic measure of the proportion of students, of individuals who went on to higher education. And it's breaking the cohort down into 5 groups according to the neighbourhood in which they lived. And you can see, again, there's quite a clear gradient, quite a substantial gap between the most and least deprived neighbourhoods, but those gaps are kind of really remaining relatively constant over this period. So there's, as John mentioned, there's going to be a whole bunch of reasons why we might see these gaps emerging. Now, in a system like the US one and also like in England to a lesser extent, we have a selective higher education system in the sense that universities typically require students to have at least a minimum level of qualifications in order to attend. We don't have institutions or many institutions that are open to anyone who wants to go. So a big part of the story, as John suggested, could be that students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds just don't have the skills or the prior attainment that are kind of required by universities in order to go. So that could be one part of the story. But there might also be a range of other things that could matter. So it could be that they have the skills but don't aspire to go to university. It could be that even though they have the aspirations to go, they don't know the right paperwork to fill in, or they don't know the right way to go about applying. Or it could be that they can do all of those things, but for some reason credit constraints are preventing them from being able to kind of take on the choices that they want. So I'm just going to show you a little bit about a couple of these. Obviously, the international literature has kind of addressed these questions to a large extent in different contexts. I'm just going to show you a couple of figures that point to the kind of drivers that we found in our work in the UK. So the first figure, which I wish I'd animated, so I'll just tell you a bit about it before I show it to you. It's going to show you, it's going to have a bar which is going to show you the gap in participation between the top 20% most advantaged students and the bottom 20% least advantaged students in terms of going to university. So it's just, you can think of it as the kind of gap between those two lines, the top and bottom lines on the area level graph, roughly. We use a slightly different measure. And then I'm going to add in information that accounts for the qualifications that students have at 16. So in the UK, we have most students taking a fairly similar set of qualifications at 16 across a wide range of subjects. And then I'll also show you the gap once we account separately for attainment at 18. So there we have students taking a wider range of qualifications, generally in a smaller set of subjects. So you'll just see what happens to the bars once I account for these measures of attainment. And here we have it. So you can see that on the left-hand side, we have the raw difference. That's showing you that there's about a 37 percentage point gap between the proportion of students from the top and bottom 20% of families' socioeconomic background, in terms of socioeconomic background, who are going to university at all. And that basically disappears entirely. It literally goes to zero once we account for attainment at 16. There's a little bit left once we account for attainment at age 18. My interpretation is just that we have slightly less rich information with which to distinguish students at 18 compared to 16. But that's really telling us very clearly that we can very well predict which students are going to be able to go on and access higher education based on the grades that they have at 16. And that is a big part in the UK of why we're seeing this picture in terms of the extensive margin. And just to reiterate that it's not some of the other things that I mentioned, this is another figure from some work that we did a few years ago now, which is just looking at the proportion of students who expect to go on to university, if you ask them about it when they're 14 years old, and comparing that to the proportion who actually end up going kind of later at similar ages, 18 and 19. Again, split by a kind of measure of socioeconomic background into 5 groups. And you can see that it's really not that lower income students don't aspire or expect to go to university. About half of them, if you ask them at age 14, say that that's what they think they'll go on to do. They're fairly or very likely to go to university. But that's about the same proportion as those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds who actually end up going. So there are gradients in both of these things, but it's not that there's a dearth of aspirations or expectations amongst these students. And that's a big part of the reason why, as Lindsay was mentioning, we found it really stubbornly difficult to kind of get rid of this gap, despite a lot of investment being put in by institutions to try and encourage individuals to go. This is really pointing to the fact that unless you're working to improve prior attainment, or you're going very strong on the role of contextualised admissions, so kind of admitting students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds with lower grades than those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, you're going to find it very difficult to work on these other factors in a way that might successfully increase access, reduce the gaps. So just kind of teeing up what Jill's going to come on to talk about on the intensive margin. So this is a very similar story to what John was saying towards the end of his presentation. This is work from that Jack and Lorraine and other colleagues in the room have contributed to, looking at how returns vary across different types of institutions in the UK. I'm not going to talk through this in detail, but if you just focus on the right-hand side, which is after accounting for what types of students access these different institutions, you can see that the kind of more selective groups of institutions, what might be called the Russell Group in the UK, they are seeing positive returns for the students who are going if you compare the earnings of individuals who go to these institutions compared to others at the age of 30. So it does matter which type of institution students are going to, as John also demonstrated very clearly. So I'm now going to show you basically three very similar graphs to what I showed you before. I'm going to show you the figures that are published by the UK Department for Education, which are this time focusing on the proportion who go to a group of more selective institutions, and again by free school meal eligibility and area deprivation. And then I'm going to show you the equivalent of my prior attainment gap, which is showing you amongst students who applied and went to university, what explains the difference between who is going to a more and less selective institution. So again, you can see here a very similar picture. I'm just going to whiz past it, give you a moment to glance at these lines and then whiz past to the next one, because there's just a couple of things that I wanted to point out which are fairly common across both graphs. So I really wanted to highlight here that we are seeing big gaps here, but there's really a big gap between the top compared to the rest in the way that there wasn't when we just looked at going to university overall. So there's a much bigger difference between our first and second quintile groups here than there was previously. And I also wanted to draw your attention to the last year of this figure, which is the kind of cohorts who were affected by the pandemic. So in the UK, individuals in this school cohort would have had grades for their kind of final qualifications that were awarded to them by teachers based on their predicted grades, as opposed to sitting the exams, which they might normally have taken outside of the pandemic. And so a lot more students than in previous years got higher grades, and universities were required to honour the offers of students who had been made offers and then met them on the basis of this new way of measuring their achievement. And you can see that led to quite a big uptick in the proportion of the cohort who were going to these more selective institutions. So more people than expected met the offers that they received from these institutions and went on to go there. But you can see that there's a much bigger uptick for those in the least deprived neighbourhoods or the most advantaged neighbourhoods than there is for those at the bottom of the distribution. So this really worked to widen the gaps that we see in terms of access to these more selective institutions very recently. And I'll just finish by showing you this very similar graph to what we had before, which is showing you here the difference in the proportion of students who are going to a more versus less selective institution amongst those who are going to university at all. And again, what happens if you account for these measures of attainment at 16 and 18. And you can see that it disappears a lot, but not entirely. So that's a very similar story to what we were hearing from John in terms of, a much broader level, attainment being important, but not everything when we're talking about the intensive margin. And on that note, I'll hand over to Jill to tell you a little bit more about what's explaining these gaps.
Oh, thank you. Hi everyone, thanks Claire. Can people hear me okay? I don't think this mic is really doing a lot. Okay, it is working. Okay, great, thank you. Right, well thanks Claire. Yes. Okay, so Claire presented two main findings really from her work. Firstly, that students from low SES backgrounds are less likely to go to university, the so-called extensive margin. And that prior attainment can fully explain those differences. They just don't get the grades to get in. The second thing that she told us is that among the group of students who do go to university, low SES students are less likely to go to high status institutions, the so-called intensive margin. And prior attainment can't quite explain all those differences. There are other reasons preventing low SES students from accessing top courses. And it's really that latter finding that I'm going to drill into in a bit more detail in my presentation. So I'm going to be looking at the types of courses that students from different backgrounds attend. And I'm going to drill down a little bit further from what Claire showed you in a couple of ways. So first of all, Claire was just looking at high status institutions versus not. I'm going to be looking at institution quality across the range of institutions, across all institutions. And actually, I'm not just going to look at institutions, I'm going to look at courses within institutions. So not just LSE, but economics at LSE, not just UCL, but physics at UCL, that kind of thing. But the aim of what I'm going to show you is to try and understand the types of courses that students from low and high SES backgrounds attend when they do go to university. And in particular, I'm going to be looking at the match between student ability and course quality. And I'm going to look at undermatch, which is high achieving students at low quality courses, and overmatch, which is low achieving students at high quality courses. And I'm asking, are there SES gaps in match? Are low SES students more likely to undermatch and less likely to overmatch? Okay, so let's get straight into it. So this is some work with Lindsay, who opened the show, and Stuart Campbell from the Bank of England, and Richard Murphy from University of Texas at Austin. And we're looking at socioeconomic gaps in match. So I'll talk you through what's going on in this slide. So let's concentrate on this left-hand panel. Left and right is not great for me, but this one here. So what am I doing here? I'm lining up students according to their attainment at age 18, okay? So I've got low attaining students at the bottom of the axis and high attainers at the top of the axis, okay? And then I'm lining up the higher education courses that these guys attend in the same way. So low quality courses will be at the bottom of the axis and high quality courses will be at the top. Now, of course, there's lots of ways that you could rank courses, that you could define course quality. You could define it according to the amount of money that's spent per head on students, student satisfaction, their position in the Guardian League tables, for example. What we're doing for the purposes of this exercise is we're ranking courses according to the attainment of students on those courses, okay? So in this world, a low quality course is one where students at age 18 did not perform well in their age 18 test scores. And a high quality course is a course where all the students did really well on their age 18 test scores. So for example, a high quality course would be something like maths at UCL, economics at LSE, where everyone enters with super high grades, okay? So I'm interested in the match between student attainment and course quality. So if a student was on this 45-degree line, they would be perfectly matched to their course, okay? A high achiever would be a high quality course, and a low achiever would be a low quality course. Students below this 45-degree line would be undermatched. They sort of undershot where they could have gone based on their grades. And a student above the y-axis, above the 45-degree line would be overmatched. They've kind of overshot and they've done very well. They're a low achiever, but they've got into a high quality course. Okay, so with all that information, what can we actually see from this chart? Well, the key finding, the main takeaway from this chart really, is that every point on the student attainment distribution, students from high SES backgrounds, which is this dotted line here, are attending higher quality courses, higher ranked courses than students from low SES backgrounds, which is the solid line here. So at every point, be it low attainers or high attainers, high SES students are getting into higher quality courses. Now, remember, they've got the same age 18 test scores, the same entry test scores, so they're just as capable, they're just as academically prepared, but the high SES students are just doing really well at getting into higher quality courses. So that's one of the key takeaways of this piece of work. On the right-hand side here, what I'm doing is I'm being robust. So these are regression coefficients where we're sizing up these gaps at each student attainment decile. So quite smaller gaps at the bottom of the distribution here, and gaps that get much bigger at the top of the distribution, and then smaller again at the very, very top. So at the very, very top, actually, it's quite close. Among very high achievers, low and high SES students are getting into similarly ranked courses. But you can see these gaps are true across the whole distribution. So in this chart here, I'm controlling for stuff. So I'm controlling for gender, ethnicity, English as an additional language, special educational needs, those kinds of things. And you can see that the gap between high and low SES students is pretty big. It still holds, okay? So this is a fairly robust finding, that we're seeing these differences in where students are going to university from different SES backgrounds. So we might ask ourselves, what's going on? How are they doing it? How are students from high SES backgrounds getting into such higher ranked courses? Well, there's four possible reasons, actually. I'm going to talk about the first three first, and then the second one I'll come on to, the fourth one I'll come on to a bit later. So there's three possible reasons to cover at the moment. Firstly, could it be about location? Could it be that students from low SES backgrounds want to study near home, and they want to live at home, study near home, and therefore they end up at a lower ranked course because that's their local course? Could it be subject of study? Could it be that students from low SES backgrounds, Could it be subject of study? Could it be that students from low SES backgrounds just study lower ranked subjects? Maybe they prefer to do humanities subjects. They tend to be academically more lower ranked, so it could be that. Or could it be something to do with school attended? Could it be that students from low SES backgrounds are just at worse schools with worse careers advice? They don't get the right advice about which qualifications which courses to apply to. The fourth reason that I'm going to come on to a bit later in new work is that maybe students from low SES backgrounds do apply to high status courses, but they get rejected by admissions officers. So we're going to look at that too. But looking at the first three reasons first. So in this slide here, I've split my sample into low attainers and high attainers because we get kind of different results for both. But let's just concentrate for now on the highest attaining students. And again, these are regression coefficients, and these are showing the SES gap in match quality. So in other words, at baseline, among high attainers, high SES students are attending courses that are around 8 percentiles higher ranked than low SES students. There's about an 8 percentile gap in the courses that they attend in favour of high SES students. So now I'm controlling for stuff to do with location, distance to university, distance to the nearest 3 universities, and distance to the nearest matched course. Okay, so I'm trying to explore whether it's the fact that low SES students are living at home, and that's what's driving this match gap. And actually what you can see here is that these do not do anything. Okay, so controlling for these things does not close the gap in the course that students attend. So it's not about location. It's not about the fact that low SES students like to live close to home. And in fact, they do like to live close to home, so they very much do typically attend their local university. However, if you look at the group of students who do attend their local university, high SES students typically find a higher quality university when they do so. The UK is small, there's lots of universities near your home, so that doesn't seem to affect much. So the next thing to explore is the subject of study. Is it that low SES students are choosing lower quality subjects, like humanities, which are less academically prestigious than STEM subjects? Well, again, you can see this does not move the needle at all. And in fact, if you take all the students studying the same subjects, so like if you take all the economics students, then high SES students typically will enroll in economics at a higher ranked institution. So it's about the institution they're choosing, not the subject that they're choosing. So the third thing that we wanted to explore is something to do with school factors. These are school fixed effects, so basically we put in a dummy for every school attended. And you can see that this actually does make a difference, both for low and high attaining students. So there's something going on there. There's something about the school that students attend that's making a difference. So basically it's saying that if we take 2 students that are in the same school, one's high SES and one's low SES, then they'll typically attend a similarly ranked course. Okay, so they're much better matched, or they're much closer matched if they're at the same school. So there's something about school attended that's explaining a lot of these gaps. Okay, so with that in mind, in this most recent piece of work, we're actually going to look at the types of schools that students attend and try and explore match gaps between those schools. And I should say that this is work with Lindsay again and Ollie Casimir Francis, who's here. and Joe Blandon. So what we're doing in this chart is I'm showing you a very similar slide to before when I showed you the SES gaps. But instead of looking at socioeconomic status, I'm looking at the high school type that students went to before they went to university. So we've got private schools here. So for those of you not from the UK, a private school in the UK is a really expensive school that you pay a lot of money for. And typically, given that parents are paying loads of money to get their kids to go to these schools, they're quite incentivized to send their kids to high-ranked universities. They're typically represented at such universities. And Lindsay's work has shown that they're more likely to get professional jobs, and more likely to be judges or lawyers or, rock stars pretending to be poor, that kind of thing. So private schools students here, which is the dark line. And then I've got, I'm splitting the rest of the school types into state schools, which is pretty much all the other schools. And then because there's so much heterogeneity in state schools, we're also showing state school students who are FSM. So that's students who are particularly deprived. FSM means free school meals. So the students on free school meals, so they're the most deprived set of students, okay? So what can you see from this chart? Well, in a very similar fashion to before. So again, I'm lining students up according to their age 18 test scores, low achievers at the bottom, high achievers at the top, and lining up courses by quality in the same way. And actually very, very similarly to what we saw when we did this for SES, we can see that students from private schools are attending higher ranked courses, again, across the distribution of attainment. They're way better at getting into good courses, high quality courses, than students from the state sector. And that's true kind of across the board of attainment again. The gaps are bigger sort of at the top of the attainment distribution among the very high attainers, but the gaps are there across the board. And they're huge in some parts of the distribution. So private school students are very, very good at getting their kids into high quality courses, even when they've got the same grades as state school students. So again, in an attempt to try and understand what's driving this, we have some hot new data, some hot new exciting UCAS data. So this comes courtesy of the fact that some of us are on secondment at the Department for Education, and so we managed to get access to this new data, which is typically very difficult to get access to. Usually we just see students when they've enrolled in university. We don't tend to see their applications, so we're very excited about this data. So there's quite a lot going on in this chart, so I'll explain it. And again, for those of us who are not from the UK or who can't remember what happened when we applied to university, this is so in the UK you get 5 shots, you get 5 choices when you apply to university. It's a centralized system. You just put them all down on your form, and again we're when we apply to university in the UK, we apply to major and university, not just institutions. So the actual course as well when we apply. So these are the 5 choices that students make in our data. And I've ordered the choices according to the selectivity of the choices. So your highest ranked choice is choice 1 here. And again, I'm showing private, state, and state plus FSM kids. On the x-axis, again, ranking students according to their attainment. And on the y-axis, ranking courses according to course quality. So what can we see from this chart? Well, a couple of interesting takeaways. First of all, like we saw before when we looked at enrollment, when it comes to applications, students from private fee-paying schools are applying to courses that are much higher ranked than students from state schools. They're really ambitious in the applications that they're making. They're applying to higher ranked courses across the board at every choice than state school students. The second thing I think to notice here is that some of these application profiles look kind of risky, right? Like if you had 5 choices to make, you might sensibly make a couple of reach choices, a matched choice, and a couple of safety school choices, okay? If you look at the private school students, that's really not what they're doing. They're going pretty bold, okay? So remember, if you're above this 45-degree line, that means you're overreaching in terms of where you're applying. As you can see for private schools, the majority of them are overreaching for the first 3 and maybe even the fourth choice, it's only really when they get to around about choice 5, or maybe a bit of choice 4, that the majority of private school students are matching to their course choice, their application. There's not a lot of safety school behaviour going on here. They're just, they're playing it risky, but it's working for them, right? We saw on the previous chat that private school students are great at getting into high quality courses. So this strategy seems to be working for them. On the other hand, if you look at the state school kids, they're playing it a lot safer. Okay, there's a couple of, they've got a reach choice in choice 1, and some of them in choice 2 are going reach. But even in their second choice, a lot of high attainers are starting to match or even undermatch. So a lot of undermatch in these choices 3, 4, and 5 are very much safety schools. Like you don't need to have 3 safety schools in your 5 choices. You're wasting your effort here. You're wasting your choices because you're probably going to get into like all 3 of them. So there's really no point in playing it that safe. But that is what state school kids are doing. So it seems from this new data that we've got, the takeaway is that we need to convince state school students to be more ambitious in the quality of courses that they're applying to, if we want to close these gaps. Okay, so just to summarise in this section, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about HE finance. On the intensive margin, so looking at the students who do go to university, we're seeing huge gaps in match between low and high SES students. So in other words, students from disadvantaged backgrounds are attending courses that are less selective than students from more advantaged backgrounds, even when they've got the same grades. And that seems to be to do with the school attended. I mean, school attended, that could mean a lot of different things. It could be careers advice, it could be your peers, where they go, etc. But it's something to do with the school. And then when we look at school type, we see large gaps in match between private schools relative to state school students. And a lot of this is driven by application behaviour. And I don't have time to show you it now, but if we try and run regressions where we size the gap in match between private and state schools, and then we control for application behaviour, the gaps close a lot. Not entirely, but they close a lot. So that's telling us that the application behaviour of students is driving this, or it's driving a lot of this. It's not that they're applying and getting rejected. Maybe there's a little bit of that, but mainly state school students are just not applying in the same droves as private school students. Okay, so that's a bit on access. Obviously, a lot of this day today, you're going to be talking about HE finance, which is a fairly topical thing to be discussing today. So we wanted to just end with a little bit of chat about the role of HE finance on access. So there's in terms of how HE finance can affect access, there's a bit of work, including by many people in this room: Sue Dynarski, Lorraine Dearden, myself, Claire Callender, looking at the role of financial support on HE participation. And there is evidence that there is some role that HE finance can play a role. Particularly, student grants have been shown to encourage low-income students to go to university. In fact, in this country, we don't have grants anymore. They were abolished in 2016, and they were replaced by bigger maintenance loans. So the whole package of student support now consists of a maintenance loan. There's not a lot of evidence on the effectiveness of swapping a grant with a loan, which is kind of what happened here. There is one paper which showed that it didn't actually seem to make a lot of difference. Students still continue to go, whether it's a grant or a loan that they're borrowing. The other thing, of course, that's big in the UK is tuition fees. Tuition fees are huge here, and there was a huge increase in 2012. But of course, tuition fees are covered by an income contingent loan. So again, the evidence that's out there suggests that big increase in tuition fees didn't particularly harm HE participation among more traditional students. So it's very difficult to actually look at the impact of that increase in fees because many other things happened at the same time. We had big changes in HE finance as well. But anyway, not a lot of evidence that HE finance really made a difference in the UK. But there's a lot of things to worry about going forward. So there are many challenges for HE finance, which you're obviously all going to talk about today. So firstly, we're going to hear about the erosion of the real value of university funding. So basically, tuition fees, as Lindsay said in her opening statement, tuition fees in the UK have been frozen for ages. And that is a problem for universities. They're becoming less and less wealthy as a result of their primary source of income being frozen for so long. That's meant increasing reliance on international student numbers. And particularly bad for access is the potential pressure on the government to reintroduce numbers caps. So at the moment, we don't have numbers caps in the UK. Universities can recruit as many students as they want. But potentially, one thing that's been talked about is a way to make it cheaper for government is to put numbers caps back on. This would be really bad for access. So work has shown that when you cap numbers, when you restrict the number of students that can go to university, it's typically the more marginal students who don't have as high grades that get squeezed out, and that tends to be the poorer students from poorer backgrounds. So that's definitely a concern. And the other thing that's a great concern for access is the erosion of real upfront financial support. So as I said, that consists mainly of, or entirely of, maintenance loans in the UK. And I've got a pretty picture which shows you how that's changed over time since the 60s. This is frozen at this is in real terms of 2023 prices. So what you can see from this chart, this is the maximum student support. So this is student support that the lowest income students get. So you can see from this chart that things have got a lot better over the last 20 years than it was before. So when we brought in tuition fees and when we raised them in 2012, things got a bit better. There was more money washing around the system, so it meant that there was more money to support students when they went to university. But what you can also see, which is very worrying, is in the last few years, there's a real dip in the in the real value of maintenance support. It's been frozen again, and also obviously we've had high inflation, so the real value of that has been slowly eroding over time. So where we used to have quite a nice system for students, in that there was no upfront costs because tuition fees were covered by a loan, and you had enough money to live on, so anyone from any background really could access higher education. That is under threat now. We're now at the point where we're back at 2012 levels in terms of the student support that students get. Students are going to have to become increasingly reliant on their parents for money to live on. Obviously, if you're from a poor background, that's a problem. So this is really a concern for access. I hope you guys on the panel are going to fix this. We look forward to that. So just to very much sum up what I just said, the challenges in terms of access when we think about HE funding are potential pressure on the government to reintroduce caps, but really the erosion of the value of financial support for students is a big problem for us as well. And I have taken up too much time, so I will stop.
Okay, so while we're getting some questions from the audience, someone did have a question online. There are a lot of questions online, but a lot of them have to do with policy, but there is a question, Jill, about the presentation. They said, can you go back to the slide on career guidance?
Maybe we could get the panel members at the table.
Career guidance.
Oh, fine. Can you go back to that slide?
I'm trying.
On career guidance, and it says, was this a key factor in student applications and decision making?
Okay. This one here?
Like, I don't know, but I guess they said it didn't show on the presentation. It said it didn't show online. Was that the one?
I guess it's this one.
Can you just go that again through while we get some questions from the audience?
Sure. Yeah. So in this chart, I mean, it's not really about career guidance, but basically what we're doing is we're looking at the gap in match between high SES and low SES students, which is about an 8 percentile gap. And then the one thing that seems to close that gap is school fixed effects, so the school that students attend. Now, that could mean anything to do with the school that students attend. Okay, it could be about careers advice in that school, but equally it could be about quality of teaching, or it could be about the peers that you have in your school, or there are myriad things that it could be about. But one possibility for sure is that it could be about career guidance. And in fact, the applications profiles of private school students suggest that maybe they are getting better guidance.
Right. Okay, would you like to join us up here? All right, and then we'll... So, can you please identify who you are? So you ask the question. So this question here first.
My question's for John. It's a very small question about the maps that you showed of social mobility for both the UK and the USA. And it occurred to me when I was looking at the maps, do those maps adjust for personal geographical movement? In other words, is it people who are born in a place and then you're measuring their income at 25 and they're still in the same place? Or when you're measuring their income, have they moved somewhere else? And does the data sort of adjust for that?
Yeah, great, thanks. So the maps, let me answer your question in kind of two parts. So first of all, just kind of as explaining what I showed, the maps take the people's incomes wherever they are. So they are not adjusting for where they're going to go. Adjusting for where you're going to go is a bit tricky because that's something that's endogenous to the path that you're on. And so I think you have to be a little bit careful about that. Let me not say about what is going on underneath the hood in the UK example, but at least in the US, we have huge differences across the country in terms of the rates of outmigration. In the places that, especially the kind of the Great Plains, those are both the highest mobility places and the places where students are least likely to stay when they're adults. But the fact that those places are high mobility is not related to the fact that there's a high level of outmigration. So that is to say, the very high mobility places, students do very well even when they stay locally. So I don't think that the location is driving much of what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. Bernard Casey from London and from Frankfurt. I wanted to ask John about positive discrimination clauses, because this is something that one certainly reads about a lot here. You didn't mention it as a potential encourager or discourager. I know some of this has changed, but is there anything in the universities and the actions of the universities which suggests that they are trying to do something, wanting to do something, or even being prevented from doing something which might or might not encourage people to go in their direction or not go? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And so, my sense is that all of the schools talk about this as something that they want to do. So at least at the level of publicly stated intentions, I think the schools really do want to not just have a group of students that come from diverse backgrounds, diverse geographically, diverse demographically. I think that it varies from institution to institution how they actually implement that in practice. So some institutions which you see having a much broader representation of students from low-income backgrounds, my sense is have pretty stark internal policies about the way that they conduct admissions and the weight that they're putting on different factors. And these schools also put a lot of energy into outreach to try to generate both awareness and then eventual applications from students that attend schools, especially that are not like typical feeder schools where encouraging students to think about this as an option. At the end of the day, I think that not a student's individual level of financing, but more the broad financing system, especially for students from low-income backgrounds, places a limit on how far schools can go. The American education financing system is set up such that it really is quite a bit more costly to admit a student from a low-income background than a high-income background. And even though schools try to be as generous as possible in some cases on this margin, at the end of the day, right, they're businesses and they have to, raise enough money to operate, and they're allocating money across a lot of different things. And so I would say that changing, I think many of the reason that schools are not more aggressive in we've shown this in some of our work, right? If you wanted to double the number of students from very low-income families, like they're there in the admissions pool, they're not that hard to find. And so, questions like, why don't they just admit them? I think the reason at the end of the day is that, they feel constrained financially. Now, of course, there's a lot of money, and so part of that is about budgetary allocations, but part of it is reflecting this underlying fact that it is much more expensive to enroll students from low-income backgrounds.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to say 3 fantastic talks. Thoroughly enjoyed it. First question to John, but Claire and Jill, feel free to pitch in on this one. You looked at SAT and ACT, and there are some sort of worries about that since the reforms of 2016. Now, we can't do that in the UK. We have nothing, no equivalent of that at all, but it's a unified assessment system across the country. So what I've got to say is there any sort of impact of GPA or grade point average coming in here? And is that causing some of the bias, or is there any correlation with GPA at all? And really, are we missing something here? We couldn't do that study in the UK, as far as I can guess from the talks. Now, my name's Mike Larkin, and I'm a retired emeritus professor in science. I'm not a social scientist, so I look at this maybe with different eyes, but I don't think we can do anything like your study in the UK to get a feel for what's really going on. And I just wondered if there was any comment on that.
So, I think, part of what you saw was, adjusting for the level of academic achievement. It's done in a different way, but I think that's, conceptually is doing something that is very, very similar to what I'm doing. And so, part of, I think, the broader lesson is that, each of these data environments are a little bit different. Sometimes, legitimately, you can't find anything to work, but oftentimes you can make it work. If I can I actually put some slides in the deck. I put some slides in the deck. Let me just pull this back up because I thought people might be interested in this. So what you find when you look at GPA in the U.S. is at least at these types of schools that I was talking about, it's quite interesting. So this is looking at these are students who are kind of at the top of the application pools for these elite schools. Some of them got in, some of them didn't get in, but they're all kind of close enough that they could have gotten in. On the left, what I'm showing you is the relationship between the test score for these students and a long-term outcome, which is, do you end up in the top 1% of the income distribution? You can do this with other outcomes, it doesn't really matter. You see that there's a pretty strong relationship. The students are all doing quite well, but the students with higher test scores are clearly on average doing better. On the right, it's the same graph looking at high school GPA, and you just see nothing. And you can look at this, you can do the same thing too, looking not at outcomes after school, you can do it on the grades that students get when they are in the school for those school students that are accepted. So this is a context where high school GPA does not seem to provide a ton of information on a student's future outcomes or kind of academic potential or something like that. But again, this is something that's kind of a pretty, there's reason to think that this might not hold universally. So for instance, these schools are taking students from across the country, across the world. We're not including international students in this because we can't really measure their outcomes as well. But when you have students coming from so many different high schools across the country, you're going to end up with grading systems that are quite different in a way that what is a top grade at one school might not be directly comparable to what is a top grade at another school. If instead you're looking at, let's say, an institution that's primarily taking students from a given state, or even a more locally oriented institution, if you're taking it from a given school district, then you might have grades that are more aligned in a way that are more predictive. You may also see that test scores and GPA measure things differentially well depending on the level of academic selectivity, right? So test scores are just about, you showed up on a given day, like, did you get these questions right? Whereas GPA is all about not just that in your classes, but there's a good part of it that's, did you show up at all? Are you engaged in the activity across a broad number of years? And so there's kind of different components that things are measuring, and again, which component is more relevant for your circumstance is something that's an empirical question.
I mean, I think just to echo what John said, that we have a much more centralised assessment system than the US, so we don't have the problem of comparable grades across high schools because we have exam boards who are setting exams which the vast majority of students in the country who are taking these qualifications will be accessing. So I think our measures of GCSE and A-level attainment, for example, are much more similar to an SAT or ACT type score than a high school GPA. So I think in practice we're doing something relatively more similar. Not exactly, but relatively more similar.
We have another question for the two of you. To what extent do you suspect that school accountability arrangements factor into pupil application behaviour?
I think I've got that. Okay, I hadn't really thought about that. What do we mean by school accountability arrangements? What kind of things?
So in the question they've mentioned progress 8, so that's like a measure of to what extent you progress in your attainment during secondary school compared to what might have been expected. Mm-hmm. I suspect that particular accountability measure is not having a dramatic effect on application behaviour because that's just not what it's incentivising schools to do. But I think it is, Anna's nodding, maybe Anna wants to chip in, but I think certainly other measures, schools, we have kind of performance tables which show the destination of students once they leave schools. So it could be that schools are responding to those incentives which exist to demonstrate to parents that they're sending a high proportion of students onto a particular institution, a particular kind of outcome or type of outcome. They could be responding there. But I think as Jill showed, it's a big part of the difference is really the state versus private school distinction. So there will be distinctions within the state system as well, of course. Yeah. But there's a whole different kind of, I guess, set of accountability criteria that you could think of for private schools as opposed to state schools.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think it's interesting that among the state schools, we broke the data up into the more deprived pupils within state schools and the less deprived. But the results are really, really similar, suggesting that there's other things going on that's driving private schools to have such a big advantage. But I mean, at its heart, I guess the question is about incentives, and I think private schools clearly have much greater incentives. They're being paid by parents. They've got to answer for that. But there's a lot to unpack there, I think.
Hi, Claire Callender. And my question may be very unfair because the data may not be available yet. And that is, my understanding is that in the last couple of years, we're seeing a fall in applications. And I wondered whether you had any insights into why that may be the case. Because up until now, we've had a constant rise, and now we're seeing, and that's a sort of potentially, given the cohort, we're at a demographic upturn rather than.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I think it'd be really interesting to know where the fall is coming from. Exactly. So let me look at the data on that one. I think I think it'd be very, very interesting to see whether it's private schools or state schools or low SES students that are dropping off. And I don't know if you have any sense of that yet.
in the past, but it's in the past. It was being the higher achieving group. Interesting what that means. When they end up going to daddy's business, I don't know. But
I mean, I think there's a demographic part of this as well, isn't there? That there were lots and lots of 18-year-olds, and I think there's been a bit of a fall, which might account for some of it. But
okay, we've got 2 minutes, so one last question.
Hi, nice quick one. Hi, I'm Kate Ogden from the IFS. Nice to hear from you all. My question was about the school of fixed effects that you showed. Firstly, whether they're school at age 16 or at 17, 18 when someone's actually doing the applying. And secondly, if you were aware of any work or done any work or planning to do work that looked at what explaining those differences in school fixed effects. And maybe DFE won't let you do that.
So it's, I can't actually remember looking over it. 18 or 16? You remember? 18. Thanks, Lindsay.
We do unpack. Thank you. And in the paper, we do unpack what's driving those school fixed effects. A lot of it's to do with the school segregation, so SES mix of the school. Also, we find a kind of big effect for also sending, like, what proportion of kids from that school go to university previously and what kinds of universities they go to. But we can't explain the overall, school fixed effect in totality, but we can get a fair way along with school characteristics. But it's in the paper.
The other thing is the subjects that are offered in the school. So not all, which is kind of a surprise to me, but not all schools offer all subjects. So if a school is much more likely to offer all of the sort of facilitating subjects that high status universities like, that made a difference as well. So so as Lindsay said, there are things that we can unpack. But I think there's more to do to try and understand what's going on.
I think there's a lot to investigate there, but lunch is now served and we're going to return here on time at 1:30 for the next session.